In the winter of 1942, a German bomber crashed into the frozen wilderness of Alaska. When rescue teams finally reached it 3 days later, the cockpit was empty. No bodies, no blood, just a half-eaten meal still sitting on the navigator's table, steam rising from a tin cup of coffee that somehow hadn't frozen yet. The hatch was sealed from the inside, and in the logbook, written in perfect German, were 2 words that made no sense. Wir bleiben. We stay. The Aleutian Islands stretched like broken teeth across the North Pacific, a chain of volcanic rock and fog that separates Alaska from the Soviet Union. Most Americans didn't even know we were fighting a war there. While the world watched Europe burn and the Pacific explode into naval warfare, something quiet and strange was happening in the frozen north. The Japanese had invaded American soil, taking the islands of Attu and Kiska in June of 1942. It was the first foreign occupation of American territory since the War of 1812, and the military wanted it buried. They called it a diversion, a sideshow. But for the men stationed there, it was hell wrapped in ice. That's where Lieutenant Richard Kowalski found himself in December of 1942, manning a radar station on Umnak Island. The base was little more than Quonset huts half buried in permafrost, surrounded by mountains that disappeared into clouds so thick you couldn't see your own boots. The wind didn't blow there. It screamed. It tore through your coat and found your bones. Kowalski had been there for 4 months, and he'd started talking to himself just to remember what his own voice sounded like. On the night of December 18th, his radar screen lit up with something that shouldn't exist. A single aircraft, flying low and slow, coming from the northwest. Not from Japan. From somewhere in the Bering Sea, where nothing lived except seals and storms. Kowalski watched the blip move across his screen, steady and deliberate, until it started descending about 40 miles inland. He called it in. The voice on the other end of the radio didn't believe him. German planes don't fly over Alaska. There's no reason, no fuel range, no logic to it. But Kowalski knew what he saw. That blip dropped off his screen and didn't come back. 3 days later, a patrol found it. A Junkers Ju-290, a long-range reconnaissance bomber that shouldn't have been within 3,000 miles of Alaska. It had come down in a narrow valley, the landing gear sheared off, but the fuselage mostly intact. The propellers were bent backward like fingers. The tail section had buckled, but the wings were still attached. It looked like the pilot had tried to land it, not crash it. That was the first strange thing. The second was the silence. When the patrol approached, there was no smoke, no fire, no distress signals. Just the plane sitting in the snow like a museum piece, the swastika on its tail still visible under a thin layer of frost. The team circled it twice before anyone got close enough to touch it. The metal was cold, but not frozen. It had been there for days, but it felt recent, fresh, like it had just landed an hour ago. They opened the hatch. It wasn't locked. It wasn't damaged. It had been closed carefully, deliberately, from the inside. And that's when they found the meal. Bread, cheese, some kind of sausage, laid out on a metal tray. A tin cup with coffee in it, still liquid, still warm to the touch, even though the temperature outside was 20 below zero. One of the soldiers reached out and touched the cup. His hand jerked back. It was hot, not warm, hot. The crew was gone. 5 men, according to the plane's manifest, which they found tucked into a leather folder in the cockpit. The pilot, co-pilot, navigator, radio operator, and a rear gunner. Their gear was still there. Their coats, their gloves, even their sidearms, sitting in holsters hanging from the bulkhead. No one abandons a plane in Alaska without a coat. No one survives that. The temperature outside would kill you in minutes. But the crew was gone, and they'd left everything behind. Kowalski was part of the investigation team that arrived 2 days later. By then, the plane had been sealed off, guarded by soldiers who looked like they hadn't slept since finding it. He climbed inside and felt it immediately. The air was wrong. It wasn't cold like it should be. It was warm, almost humid, like the inside of a tent with too many bodies. The instruments on the dashboard were still lit, glowing faintly even though the engines were dead and there was no generator running. The altimeter needle was spinning slowly, clockwise, even though the plane was on the ground. In the navigator's station, Kowalski found the logbook. It was written in German, but one of the intelligence officers translated it later. Most of it was standard: coordinates, fuel consumption, weather reports. But the last entry, written in a different handwriting, shaky and uneven, were just two words: Wir bleiben, we stay. Underneath it, someone had drawn a symbol, not a swastika, something else, a circle with lines radiating outward like a sun or a compass rose or something older. They searched the valley for weeks. They brought in dogs, tracking teams, even a few native guides who knew the land better than anyone. They found nothing. No footprints, no bodies, no trace of 5 men who had vanished from a sealed plane in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. The snow around the crash site was undisturbed, smooth and perfect, like no one had ever been there at all. But inside the plane, in the cargo hold, they found something that made the entire investigation go quiet. Crates, dozens of them, sealed with German military stamps, and inside those crates were maps. Not maps of Alaska, not maps of the Pacific, maps of tunnels, underground networks, places that didn't exist on any chart. And every single one of them was marked with the same symbol from the logbook. The military classified the entire incident. The plane was dismantled and shipped to a base in Nevada. The soldiers who found it were reassigned. The reports were buried. And Lieutenant Richard Kowalski spent the rest of his life wondering what he'd really seen in that valley, because 3 months later, in March of 1943, his radar picked up another blip. Same location, same flight pattern, same slow descent into the same valley. He called it in. They told him he was mistaken. They told him to ignore it. But Kowalski knew. Something had come to Alaska, and it had never left.
Richard Kowalski never forgot that second blip. It haunted him the way only unanswered questions can, the kind that burrow into your sleep and wait for you in the quiet moments. After the war, he went back to Pennsylvania, married a school teacher, raised 2 kids, worked at a steel mill for 30 years. He never talked about Alaska. Not to his wife, not to his friends. But every December 18th, he'd sit in his garage with a bottle of whiskey and a notebook full of things he wasn't supposed to remember. In 1987, 3 weeks before he died, he sent that notebook to a researcher at the University of Washington. Inside was a single question written on the first page. What were they looking for? The official explanation was simple: weather reconnaissance, engine failure, navigation error, a tragic accident in a forgotten theater of war. But that explanation never accounted for the maps. It never explained the warm coffee or the fact that the plane's engines showed no signs of failure. The mechanics who examined it said the same thing. It hadn't crashed. It had landed, deliberately, like the pilot knew exactly where he was going. In 1997, a documentary crew found one surviving member of the original patrol team. He sat in his living room in Oregon, oxygen tube in his nose, and told them something he'd kept silent for 54 years. When they opened the cargo hold and found those crates, there was something else, a radio. Not military issue, something handmade. It was still transmitting when they found it, a low-frequency signal pulsing into the wilderness. They shut it down. 3 days later, Carver's entire unit was transferred to the South Pacific. No explanation, no warning. The radio was never mentioned in any report.
The maps told a different story. After the plane was dismantled, the crates were sent to Army intelligence. Most disappeared into classified archives, but a few pages surfaced decades later. They showed underground structures beneath the Aleutian Islands, tunnels that predated the war, predated the Russians, predated anything the Army had records of. Some markings were in German, but others were older. The same symbol from the logbook, the same one Kowalski drew over and over in his notebook margins, like he was trying to decode it. In 2003, geologists surveying volcanic activity found an entrance, a cave system on Omnak Island, 15 miles from where Kowalski's radar station used to be. The walls were too smooth, too uniform, carved with precision that didn't match natural erosion. They went inside with lights and cameras. What they found was a chamber, a circular room about 100 feet across, ceiling disappearing into darkness. The walls were covered in markings, systematic, mathematical. And in the center was a metal platform, corroded and ancient, with grooves that looked like landing gear impressions. The site was immediately closed. Federal agents arrived within 48 hours. The cave entrance was sealed with concrete. The geologists were questioned, their footage confiscated. One of them kept copies of her photographs. She published them anonymously online in 2011. The images went viral for a week before being scrubbed from most platforms, but people downloaded them, people saw them, and people started asking questions. Here's what we know. In late 1942, the German military was obsessed with secret weapons, Die Glocke, underground facilities, Wunderwaffe projects that consumed real resources and real manpower. They were searching for something, an edge, a breakthrough. And some of those projects involved maps, old maps, maps that supposedly showed locations of ancient technology, sites of power, places that existed before recorded history. What if they found something? What if those maps led them to Alaska, to volcanic islands in the middle of nowhere, where fog hides anything and cold keeps everyone away? What if that plane wasn't lost? What if the crew didn't disappear, but went deeper, into the tunnels, into the earth, looking for whatever was down there? Kowalski believed it. In his final letter, he wrote about the second blip in March of 1943. He watched it on radar for 20 minutes before it descended. This time, he said, it didn't crash. It landed, smoothly, perfectly, in the exact same spot. He requested permission to investigate. Permission was denied. A week later, his radar station was decommissioned and he was shipped to North Africa. But before he left, he went to the valley one last time. He didn't tell anyone. He just took a jeep and hiked through knee-deep snow. The wreckage of the first plane was gone, hauled away by the military. But there were marks in the ground, depressions in the snow. And near the valley's edge, he found something the patrol teams had missed. A hatch, metal, seamless, buried under thin ice. He tried to open it. It wouldn't move. But when he put his hand on it, he felt vibration. Something below. Something active. He left it there and never told anyone until he was dying. The German plane that crashed in Alaska was never claimed. No nation acknowledged it. The crew was never found. Their names were never released. The maps were never fully declassified. Somewhere in a storage facility, those crates are probably still sitting there, sealed, forgotten, waiting. But if you go to Omnak Island today, if you ask the right people, the ones who've lived there their whole lives, they'll tell you stories about lights in the fog, about sounds under the ground, about nights when the wind stops and you can hear something humming, low and steady, like a machine that never turned off. They'll tell you the valley is cursed, that people who go there don't always come back the same, that sometimes, on December 18th, you can still hear engines in the distance, coming closer, then stopping. "We stay," the logbook said. And maybe they did. Maybe whatever they were looking for is still down there. Maybe they found it, or maybe it found them. The question Richard Kowalski asked remains unanswered. What were they looking for? And more importantly, did they ever leave?